Coal soon signed its own death warrant as London's fuel by killing 4,000 people in the fog of December 4, 1952. Chilly weather and stagnant air meant a million chimneys smoke hovered over the streets of London for a week, reducing visibility to near zero. Healthy people found breathing uncomfortable, those with lung ailments often found it fatally difficult. In the 20th century, only the 1918 influenza pandemic killed more Londoners. Public outcry and government inquiry followed, leading to the Clean Air Act of 1956, which sharply regulated domestic coal smoke. This helped London switch to gas and electric heat. Weaned from coal, London's smoke problem shrank to insignificance after 1956. Its sulfur emissions, even though not regulated until 1972, fell 90% mainly because of the fuel shift. After the 1960s, London's air quality suffered more from tailpipe exhausts than from smokestack and chimney emissions. Ironically, the clearer air after the mid-1950s allowed more sunshine to penetrate to the city streets, where it reacted with tailpipe emissions to form photochemical smog. Londoners remain as attached to their right to drive cars as Orwell was to the right to a coal fire. 37. Pittsburgh. In the United States, many cities built their energy systems around coal between 1850 and 1900. St. Louis and Chicago exploited the bituminous coal of southern Illinois, Pittsburgh and Cincinnati that of western Pennsylvania. They all had pollution problems, and from 1868 forward enacted smoke abatement laws. But no measures sufficed, and all remained smoky and sulfurous until 1940. Rebecca Harding Davis began her 1861 short story Life in the Iron Mills this way. A cloudy day. Do you know what that is in a town of ironworks? The sky sank down before dawn, muddy, flat, immovable. The idiosyncrasy of this town is smoke. It rolls suddenly in slow folds from the great chimneys of the iron foundries and settles down in black, slimy pools on the muddy streets. Smoke on the wharves, smoke on the dingy boats, on the yellow river, clinging in a coating of greasy soot to the house front, the two faded poplars, the faces of the passers-by. 38. This description reflected the Wheeling, West Virginia of Davis's youth. Journalist Waldo Frank wrote of Chicago in 1919, "Here is sooty sky hanging forever lower. The sky is a stain, the air is streaked with the running of grease and smoke. Blanketing the prairie, this fall of filth, like black snow, a storm that does not stop." 39 Wheeling, Chicago, and scores of industrial towns in between were smothered in coal smoke for decades. Pittsburgh was the smokiest of all. Pittsburgh first used coal in 1758, when it was a small fort perched at the edge of British settlement in the American colonies. Abundant local supply recommended coal even over wood. At the end of the Civil War, half the glass and 40% of the iron made in the United States came from Allegheny County, the Pittsburgh area. The smoke inspired one 1866 visitor to describe the city of 100,000 as hell with the lid taken off. Then the Second Industrial Revolution came to Pittsburgh, and the steel industry took off. In 1884, this city of 300,000 people used 3 million tons of coal, 5% of the national total. For a brief interlude around 1887 to 1891, natural gas from the Appalachians drove down coal use in Pittsburgh and the skies cleared. But gas supplies ran out, coal returned, steel flourished, Pittsburgh grew, and smoke returned with a vengeance. Even Andrew Carnegie, whose coal-fired steel mills made him one of the world's richest men, complained of smoke in 1898. Smoke abatement laws had little effect. From the 1890s through the early 1940s, Pittsburgh became more like hell with the lid clamped on. For Pittsburgh's air, war was both hell and salvation. In 1940 and 1941, military orders boosted production, and the use of all available equipment, however old and inefficient, initially intensified Pittsburgh's smoke and pollution. But the example of St. Louis, where engineers, citizens, and politicians had come together to enact effective smoke prevention law in 1940, inspired Pittsburgh to imitation. 41 In late 1941 it too passed such laws. They were suspended for the duration of the war, but enforced on industry in 1946 and on homes in 1947, despite objections from coal interests, the United Mine Workers, and the railroads. Pittsburgh converted to cleaner anthracite coal, oil, and natural gas piped in from Texas. Locomotives and riverboats converted to electricity or diesel fuel. By 1953, Pittsburgh's air was cleaner than at any time since the Civil War, excepting, perhaps, 1887 to 1891.42 tighter laws and more efficient fuel use continued to improve Pittsburgh's air in the 1950s and 1960s. Then, after the mid-1970s, the steel industry collapsed, mills closed, population declined, and Pittsburgh ceased to be a foremost manufacturing city, and the air got cleaner still. In 1985, a weekly magazine rated Pittsburgh as America's most livable city. Both London and Pittsburgh underwent transformations that denizens of either city in 1900 or 1930 would have regarded as impossible. They did it at about the same time, which is partly coincidence, but partly not. Both transformations required the emergence of alternate fuels that permitted a cleaner energy system without any special economic sacrifice. Certainly some people suffered in the transition: coal delivery men, chimney sweeps, laundry operators, but others benefited: pipe fitters, electricians, appliance salesmen. The coal industry survived in England and Pennsylvania until decades after the changes in the urban energy systems. Both transformations were eased by decentralization, the drift of population to suburbs abetted by the spread of cars. Both cities, although not their conurbations, slowly lost population. London's peak came in 1940, Pittsburgh's in 1950. Dozens of coal cities in the United States and Western Europe followed roughly the same pattern, making for a great improvement in urban life for tens of millions. 43. Smog cities. Smog is a term first coined by a London medical doctor in 1905 to mean smoke plus fog. It has evolved to mean any pollution-caused haze, in particular that created by the reaction between sunlight and nitrogen oxides or hydrocarbons. These pollutants, the precursors to smog, come mainly from vehicle exhausts. But they can also come from biomass burning or industrial combustion. In sunlight, they tend to produce ozone, the most troublesome component of smog. Smog causes eye irritation and lung problems in people and damages plants as well. Geography matters in smog formation. It develops only where there is plenty of sunlight and grows serious where topography and winds conspire to keep pollutants from dispersing. So sunny cities in bowls or basins, with mountains all around, are the most vulnerable. Mexico City fits that description all too well. Slightly less vulnerable, on geographic criteria alone, are Santiago, Los Angeles, Athens, Tehran, Chengdu, and Seoul. Los Angeles. Photochemical smog made its debut in the human consciousness in Los Angeles, where the problem attracted notice in the early 1940s. During World War II, acute smog was mistaken for Japanese gas attacks. Soon after it, smog became a regular character in Raymond Chandler novels and other Los Angeles literature. 44 Ever since, it has ranked high among daily complaints and political issues in Southern California. Here topography and history conspired. Los Angeles occupies a small coastal plain hemmed in by mountains on three sides. It has daily sea breezes that often blow yesterday's pollution back over the city, and frequent thermal inversions, which block the upward escape of pollution. 45. The American Southwest would not have big cities or smog without the cheap energy characteristic of the fossil fuel age. This, and cheap water, made possible Greater Los Angeles's growth from 100,000 in 1900 to 1.4 million in 1930 to 6 million by 1960. 46 American cities built after 1920 were shaped by mass ownership of automobiles, none more than Los Angeles, with its sprawl and freeways. In the 1940s, like several other American cities, it dismantled its system of public trains to make way for cars. Los Angeles's auto population quadrupled between 1950 and 1990. Los Angeles is a city built for cars in a setting made for smog. Smog became a political issue in the 1940s. The Los Angeles Times hired Raymond Tucker, the central figure in St. Louis's smoke reduction, in a press campaign for cleaner air. In 1947, the city created air quality boards that began to regulate refineries, factories, and finally even cars. By the 1960s, smog annoyed some 10 million people hundreds of days of the year and stunted tree growth as much as 80 kilometers away. After more stringent regulations in the early 1970s, ozone and smog decreased by about half in the Los Angeles basin, despite more cars and more driving. Yet in 1976, Los Angeles's air still reached officially unhealthy levels 3 days out of 4. In the 1990s, Los Angeles smog remained a regular health hazard, the most serious urban air pollution problem in the United States. 47. Athens. Athens was built 2,500 years before cars. Yet it too acquired a serious pollution problem, which Athenians, for decades, have called tenephos. Mountains surround the city on 3 sides, the sea borders the 4th. Thermal inversions are common in spring and fall. Like Los Angeles, Athens has a sunny climate, ideal for smog formation. Modern Athens took shape after it became the capital of Greece in 1834. Its population climbed from 15,000 to 500,000 between 1830 and 1920, then quickly doubled as refugees from Anatolia poured in after a Greek military adventure there went awry. It reached 2 million by the early 1960s and 3 million by 1980, by which time it occupied almost all the land between the sea and the mountains and accommodated 1/3 of the country's population. Greater Athens has long hosted a large share of Greek industry, especially in the vicinity of Piraeus. Paint, paper, chemical, tanning, steel, shipbuilding industries, and more, half of Greek industry by 1960, squeezed into the capital area. Most factories were small-scale, unregulated, and energy inefficient. Electrification, which grew exponentially after 1950, was based on fossil fuel burning power stations in the western part of the city. 48. Home heating added to the mix. Athens burned mainly wood and charcoal in 1920, but then took increasingly to imported coal until the Depression hit in 1931. After the further disruptions of World War II and the Greek Civil War, Athens slowly converted to an energy base of imported oil and domestic lignite, a dirty coal. 49. Before 1965, smokestacks and chimneys accounted for most of Athens' pollution, which took the form of smoke and sulfur dioxide. Much worse was yet to come. The automobile colonized Athens after 1955. The Athens subway, one of the world's first, consisted until 1997 of only a single line. For most Athenians, there was no alternative to surface transport. In 1965, the city had 100,000 cars, and by 1983, 1 million. Since Greeks kept cars on the road for a long time, this vehicle fleet contained a hefty share of old clunkers, spewing out extra smog ingredients into the bright Athenian sunshine. 50. The unplanned growth of the city created a labyrinthine street pattern that contributed to traffic jams. The siesta tradition meant Athens featured for rush hours daily. At any given time after 1975, a large proportion of the engines running in Athenian cars were idling out of gear, waiting for traffic to clear. Until the late 1990s, Athenian buses, many of them imported from Eastern Europe, were notorious polluters. All this combined to maximize tailpipe emissions per vehicle. Occasional haze obscured visibility in Athens from at least the 1930s, 51, but tenephos appeared only in the 1970s. Smoke and sulfur dioxide levels actually dropped after 1977, their regulation amounted to a modest political challenge. But smog persisted, and indeed intensified after 1975 as Athens grew so prosperous that most families aspired to car ownership. The worst episode came during a heat wave in 1987, with excess mortality of about 2,000. Ozone levels in the late 1980s were twice those of 1900 to 1940. Controlling cars proved a sterner political challenge than checking. Tenephos entered Greek politics in the 1981 elections, when the Socialist Party implausibly promised to eradicate air pollution within 3 years, hoping perhaps to secure the gullible vote. PASIC 1, restricted industrial fuel burning, introduced low-lead gasoline. and enacted rules prohibiting driving in the city center on alternate days, based on odd and even license plate numbers. 53 prosperous Athenians responded by buying second cars. Emission checks came in the early 1990s. These and further measures did not suffice, partly because of the unfortunate geography of Athens, and partly because enforcement of anti-pollution laws remained lax. 54 By the early 1990s, Athens' smog was 2 to 6 times as thick as that of Los Angeles. 55 Urban smog, in Los Angeles, Athens, or most anywhere else, persisted because most citizens preferred driving cars and breathing smog to limits on driving and less smog. It also persisted because of two things about which citizens had less choice: the weakness of public transit and the technology of automobile engines. Megacities. Rural exodus and natural population increase in cities after 1950 combined to create a new chapter in the human experience. In 1950, only 3 conurbations in the world approached 10 million inhabitants: London, New York, and Tokyo, Yokohama. By 1997, 20 cities surpassed 10 million, most in societies where law and regulation were uncertain, politics often unstable, and public finance always scarce. Urban growth outpaced basic infrastructure. Pollution in such circumstances was hard to control. Mexico City. The Aztecs in 1325 chose a magnificent setting for their capital Tenochtitlan, but the choice has come to haunt their descendants. 56 From the air pollution standpoint, Mexico City, in a steep-sided bowl, is a topographical error. Temperature inversions occur on 50 to 80% of days between November and May. At over 2,200 meters, cars run inefficiently, generating more pollutants, and oxygen is scarce, intensifying the adverse health effects of ozone and carbon monoxide. There's plenty of sunshine to cook up smog. For a long time, none of this mattered. The clarity of the air impressed the German scientist Alexander von Humboldt in 1803, and the air remained unusually transparent for another century and a half. 57 In 1900, Mexico City had 350,000 residents, many fewer than Pittsburgh. It then grew 60-fold in the 20th century, as shown in Table 3.4. Table 3.4 Mexico City population, 1900-1997. Mexico City also industrialized. In 1930, it had 7% of the nation's industry, by 1980 over 30%. This demographic and industrial growth reflected the centralizing ambitions of the leadership installed by the Mexican Revolution. By 1990, the bowl had 30,000 industries, of which 4,000 burned Mexico's high-sulfur fossil fuels. 58 Mexico City also converted to motorized transport. The car fleet swelled from perhaps 100,000 in 1950 to 2 million in 1980 and over 4 million in 1994. Motor vehicles emitted about 85% of air pollutants in Mexico City in the 1980s, cars accounting for 2/3, trucks and buses for the rest. The government, which owned the fossil fuel industries, for years discouraged energy conservation. The gasoline tax was 1/10 that of Japan and 1/20 that of Holland or Italy. Air pollution problem. In the 1970s, sulfur dioxide levels in Mexico City usually ranged from 1 to 4 times the guideline of the World Health Organization, occasionally reaching 10 or 15 times safe concentrations. 59 They climbed only slightly in the 1980s. Greater use of natural gas partly offset the city's growth. From 1975 to 1990, dust and soot grew thicker, from roughly twice to about 3 or 6 times WHO guidelines. 60 From 1965 to 1985, lead in the air doubled, reaching levels 5 times the Mexican legal limit, which prompted the introduction in 1986 of low-lead gasoline. The new gasoline unfortunately involved the use of additives that compounded the ozone problem. Residents of Mexico City gasped and wheezed, and died 61, from air pollution as much as any urban population anywhere. Schools occasionally closed for ozone alerts. Cautious parents equipped their children with surgical masks and tried to keep them indoors during peak pollution hours. Vegetation on the surrounding mountains suffered, affecting the water balance of the city. Tree rings from a fir grove southwest of the city showed sharply reduced growth from the 1960s. By 1993, pollution had killed 1/3 of the firs. In one acute pollution episode in 1985, birds fell out of the sky in mid-flight onto the Zocalo, Mexico City's Great Plaza. 62. The policy response to air pollution in Mexico City included several measures: incentives to relocate industry, the introduction of low-lead gasoline. Voluntary vehicle inspections quickly followed by mandatory vehicle inspections, driving restrictions. Reforestation and propaganda campaigns featuring cartoon birds that exhorted children to conserve energy and water. Even moss received legal protection. The United Nations twice awarded Mexico City prizes for its anti-pollution efforts. By 1990 or so, the air stopped getting worse and by some measures improved. Sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead concentrations no longer regularly exceeded guidelines after 1990. But other pollutants, mainly ozone, caused the city's air to violate international standards on 90% of days during 1991 to 1995. 63. Extreme population growth and ordinary motorization, superimposed upon the Aztec choice of capital and the Mexican Revolution's commitment to centralization, made Mexico City's air pollution resistant to even the most vigorous anti-pollution policy. Centuries of history are not easily undone by public policy. Calcutta. In some ways, Calcutta suffered the worst of two worlds. 64. It became a Victorian coal city in the late 19th century and in the late 20th evolved into a classic megacity, with a population that grew faster than infrastructure and urban services. It achieved extraordinary success in regulating smoke after 1903, but eventually its growth outpaced its pollution control capacity. Calcutta grew from about 1 million people in 1900 to almost 5 million by 1950, and then about twice that by 1980. These changes were spurred by natural population increase, rural exodus, and refugee settlement after the political violence that attended the partition of India in 1947, 1948, and the war with Pakistan in 1970-1971. The city lies close to the coalfields of West Bengal, which made it a premier industrial city of India after 1880. It developed some dirty industries, including iron and steel, glass, jute, chemicals, and paper, powered until the 1940s by the high-ash coal of Bengal. Calcutta's setting, with frequent calms and thermal inversions in the winter months, often made for stagnant air. Visitors complained of the air in the 18th century, but it was the railway link to Bengal's coal fields that transformed Calcutta into a coal smoke city. Jute and cotton mills led the way in fouling the air, but locomotives, steamships, home hearths, and coke-making contributed to the haze. By the 1920s, Calcutta had 2,500 coal-fired steam boilers. In calm weather, smoke lingered and death rates tripled. Laws against coal smoke, first enacted in 1863, proved difficult to enforce until the reforming zeal of the Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, resulted in a smoke inspectorate. Curzon told Bengal's Chamber of Commerce that smoke besmirches the midday sky with its vulgar tar brush and turns our sunsets into murky gloom. 65. Between 1906 and 1912, numerous tall stacks sprouted in Calcutta and observable ground-level smoke declined by about 90%. In the 1920s, the Smoke Inspectorate installed a rooftop observatory and by telephone scolded factory managers instantly when their smokestacks belched out thick smoke. Smoke levels declined sharply again. Probably no other industrial city in the world, before or since, has operated a pollution notification system so ambitiously conceived, so comprehensive in range, or so penetrating in its disciplinary effects. 66. The authoritarian power of the colonial government in India made smoke control easier there than in London or Pittsburgh, where coal interests retained great power. Curzon regarded smoke as a blemish on the escutcheon of European civilization and a poor advertisement for the benefits of imperialism. It had to go. After the 1920s, with industrial smoke emissions under control, Calcutta enjoyed a breathing spell. But as demographic growth accelerated after 1950, smoke problems returned. In the 1970s, Calcutta's sulfur dioxide concentrations more than doubled, reaching levels that averaged 25% above WHO standards, despite the low sulfur coal. But Calcutta's most serious pollution problems came from domestic coal dust and soot, not sulfur dioxide. Its dust and soot levels billowed up in the 1970s, before leveling off at 3 to 10 times WHO standards. For human lungs, breathing Calcutta's air after 1975 was equivalent to smoking a pack of Indian cigarettes a day. Nearly two-thirds of the population in the 1980s suffered lung ailments attributed to air pollution, chiefly particulates. Domestic use of coal probably damaged health at least as much as did industrial emissions, although industry used far more coal. Calcutta's dwellings, almost all cooked with coal, and women and small children routinely inhaled soot and dust while preparing their meals. Men, who rarely cooked, breathed cleaner air. Motor vehicles added little to the air pollution problems of Calcutta until the 1980s. After 1980, the fleet doubled every 6 years, reaching 500,000 in 1992. With little in the way of tailpipe emission standards and copious sunshine, ozone levels presumably grew rapidly. After 1991, when the Indian state lowered protection barriers and liberalized the economy, a newly prosperous class emerged in Calcutta as elsewhere, eager to drive private cars, so tailpipes contributed more and more to the air pollution cocktail of Calcutta. Population growth, the difficulty of regulating domestic fuel use, and eventual motorization brought the murky gloom of a century before back to Calcutta. By and large, the world's megacities all created air pollution problems as they grew. Those in rich, stable, and technically advanced societies lowered pollution levels sharply after 1970. Most of the rest got worse, as tailpipe pollution joined smokestack and chimney sources. The most acute problems plagued those cities cursed by geography. Beijing, Cairo, and Karachi suffered from desert dust as well as high levels of man-made pollutants. Mexico City and Seoul suffered from poor ventilation. In the early 1990s, Mexico City had the worst air of all megacities. Beijing, Shanghai, Seoul, and Cairo competed for a distant second place. Monitoring was so inadequate in Dhaka, Lagos, and a few other megacities that no one could tell where they fit in the circles of air pollution held. 67. While Mexico City and Calcutta had limited or fleeting success in improving their air quality, some smaller cities did better. Ankara. Ankara was a sleepy provincial town of 30,000 when it became the capital of Turkey in the 1920s. The Turkish Revolution led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk shared the centralizing tendencies of the Mexican Revolution, and Ankara doubled in population every decade from 1920 until 1980. Although it lies in a shallow bowl and has frequent wintertime temperature inversions, Ankara had no notable air pollution problems until the 1960s. But by 1970, when its population reached about 1 million residents, Ankara's emissions surpassed a threshold and developed growing sulfur dioxide, smoke, and soot problems, derived mainly from power stations and household use of lignite. High oil prices after 1973 drove Turkey to develop its lignite, which is high in sulfur and ash. Ankara's air became the worst in Turkey. By 1990, it had 4 million people, 500,000 cars, and, in winter at least, air quality among the worst in the world. By the early 1990s, spurred in part by the long-standing Turkish quest to conform to European Union standards in hopes of admission to that club, Ankara began to tighten pollution controls and convert to natural gas, piped in from Siberia. Its air improved dramatically, despite continued urban growth. 68. Cubatao. Nestled between the sea and a steep escarpment, Cubatao, Brazil, is close to São Paulo and closer to the port of Santos. In 1950, it consisted chiefly of banana plantations and mangrove swamp, but because of its hydroelectric potential and port access soon became a target for state-sponsored industrialization. This succeeded too well during Brazil's boom years of the 1960s and 1970s. Cubatao by 1980 became a city of 100,000, producing 40% of Brazil's steel and fertilizers and 7% of Brazil's tax revenues, but it earned the nickname Valley of Death. Its infant mortality was 10 times the average for São Paulo state. 35% of infants died before their first birthday. Soot and dust averaged double the state's state of alert levels in 1980. Cubatao had no birds, allegedly no insects, 69, and its trees became blackened skeletons. Laboratory rats installed in a rented room in Villa Parisi, the poorest and most polluted part of town, managed to survive 1986 pollution levels, but with severe ill effects on their respiratory systems. 70 acid